Horror Rules.
Are you gaming with me? Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sweet Strats. I'm your host, Harley, and here are the Arkham Horror Rules. I kind of messed up. Hey, it wouldn't be a Sweet Strats show without us messing up at least once, or me particularly. So I left some rules out. They're going to be at the end of the video, just to catch you up on. So make sure to stay to past the end of the rules video for some more rules. Okay, guys, let's do the rules. So, first off, we had the agenda deck. Now, this is the evil deck that advances and makes it close to us losing the game. Next, we have the act deck. This is what we want to advance. This is the investigator's advance. We advance it with clues that we find throughout locations. This is the scenario card. And what this card does is it tells us what some of the chaos tokens in our chaos bag do when we pull them, such as the skull, the cultist member, and I'm guessing that's a heart. I'm not exactly sure. Then we have the encounter deck. We draw one of these cards every time at the end of the mythos phase, and we'll get to the phases in just a second. This is the locations that we start at. If you start at a location, it's flipped over and unlocked. But for the rest of the locations that you don't start at, you'll notice a little symbol that looks like a little key, and it signifies that it's locked. When an investigator visits that place to remove action, it unlocks it, and we see that on the left-hand side in black is the shroud value, which tells us what our skill check needs to be for investigating. And on the right side, you'll see how many clues are at the location. And it has a number and a little investigator symbol. And that means 2 times the number of investigators, or whatever number times the number of investigators. So since it's just me, it's going to be 2 or 4 or whatever the number is on the card. If 2 of us were playing now, it'd be 2 times 2, which would be, there'd be 4 clues at that location. It's also, I need to mention that on the act deck, we have the same number, and you have to place 2 times the number of investigator clues on the act deck in order to advance it, which would mean we had to place 2 clues on it. So the 2 clues we'd gain from our location is what we'd use to advance it. It's also important to note that you don't have to spend an action in order to place the clues on the act deck. You can do that anytime during your turn. Next, we have this is the player deck, or we draw 5 cards at the beginning of the game. If we get any cards that are weaknesses, there are 2 in every investigator deck, such as the Silver Twilight Acolyte. Then you set that aside and you draw another card. You never start your hand with a weakness. Now, subsequently, when playing, if you draw a weakness, you have to immediately either resolve it, or in this case, as it was an enemy, it would go into your threat area, and we'll discuss about threat area in just a second. Otherwise, you can either keep your cards, or you can mulligan. And if you decide to mulligan, you decide however many cards you want to change out, either 1 through 5. So you can discard up to 1 card or your entire hand if you want. Set those aside and draw the amount of cards that you discarded. Take into effect that if you draw a weakness card, you just set that aside and draw again. You never have a weakness card in your opening hand. Okay, lastly, each investigator gets 3 actions. And normally, when you take your 3 action, you flip your little mini card over. But since it's only me, there's really no need to do that. So I elected to choose to use these cubes to represent my actions that I've used. So I'll just place a cube on top of my mini card every time I use an action to keep track. The last thing we want to talk about is our character card. The character card tells you what every character has their own special ability. They also have their own ability when the Elder Sign token is pulled out of the Chaos bag. But it also has your hit points, your sanity. It has your the head is your willpower value. The book is your intellect value. Of course, the fist is your fight value. And the feet are your agility value. And you'll use those for skill checks, which we'll go over in just a second. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about the phases. The first phase, which you always skip at the start of the game, is the Mythos phase. But we're going to go ahead and talk about it right now. So the first thing you do is you add a Doom token to the agenda deck, or to the current agenda. Okay. Next, you check the Doom threshold, which I didn't mention this, but the number on the agenda card that's face up is the Doom threshold. Once you reach the threshold, you advance the agenda deck. So the Doom tokens count for all Doom tokens in play. There are certain cards that place Doom tokens on them, and you would account for those too. So if I had 2 Doom tokens on my agenda card and 1 in my play area, that would count as 3, and the agenda deck would advance. Okay, and when that happens, we simply take all the Doom counters out of play, and we advance to the next card. Of course, we'll read everything in between. Lastly, in the Mythos phase, every investigator, which since it's only me, will draw 1 encounter card. And the encounter cards can have either an enemy, like the Swarm of Rats, which immediately engages with the investigator that drew them. Okay, and we'll talk about engagement in just a second. It could be treachery, like Dissonant Voices, and this one in particular would go into your threat area as well, and you would follow up with everything that it says in order to get rid of it, or it may stay with you. Or you could also get a treachery like Rotten Remains, and this one simply once you reveal it, you have to perform a test. Once you perform a test, it's done. It goes into the discard area. And then once we need to refill our encounter deck, we'll shuffle and go. Okay, after the Mythos phase is the Investigator's phase, and the Investigator, of course, has 3 actions. Some cards will give you more. I'm going to talk about the non-skill check actions first. So the first thing you can do is you can draw a card from your deck, or you can decide to gain a resource for an action. Next, you can play an event card, such as one like this, such as Mind Over Matter, and resolve it. Or you could also, you could play a card, not an event card, but you could play a card such as an event card, or you could play an asset card and pay its cost, which is the cost of the card is always in the upper left-hand corner, and you then put it in your play area. It's important to note that your player only has 7 slots. They have an asset slot, which is for certain allies that you can place in the game. You have 2 hand slots, 2 spell slots, a a body slot, which you'll see for armor, and a trinket slot. And it's called an accessory slot. And each card will say whether it's a weapon, and they'll also in the bottom right-hand corner they'll mark what slot they take up. There are some assets that do not fill up one of these slots, and if the card does not fill up a slot, you can play as many of them as you want. But in order to, if both your hands are full of weapons, in order to play another weapon or a card that goes into a hand slot, you have to discard one of the cards that are in your hand slot. And there are cards that will take up both hand slots and cards that will take up both spell slots. The next thing you can do is you can move. So if there's a connected location, which we'll see in our game, you can go from one location to the next. And that's basically what your mini card is for. Not only to mark your actions and to see if your turn is done, but also to show what locations you're at. Okay? And remember, once you move to a location, if the location was locked, you would immediately flip it over and reveal it. Let's see. So those are all the actions that don't require skill checks. The rest of the actions that you'll have is engage. You can also decide for an action. Now this won't apply to us, but if we were playing with multiple investigators, if an investigator had a monster or a creature on him, we could choose to engage it, and we would bring that monster into our area, and it would be engaged with us instead of our friends. Okay. Now, the last action that you have are fight, evade, and investigate. These all require skill checks. Okay, I'm going to talk about the investigate action first. I'm going to talk about skill checks first. We're going to talk about it with investigate. And all skill checks work like this. Depending on the value, okay, let me back up. So we're going to investigate. The shroud value for the place where a clue would be is 2. Okay? Our intellect is 3. So it's basically 2 versus 3. Next, what we have to do is we draw a chaos token out of the chaos bag. And we either plus or minus whatever it is with our value, with our intellect value, because it's an intellect check for an investigation. So before you pull a chaos token out, you can use cards from your hand for their symbols that are on the side instead of their actual text. Okay, like this one particularly wouldn't be good, but let's just say there were a couple of book symbols on here. So I could add the 2 book symbols to my value, and now I have a value of 5. I could add as many cards as I want for my value, unless I have a restriction from other cards. Okay, so we're just going to say that I have a value of 5. I've given myself a value of 5. Now, if we were playing with other investigators, at this time, they would have the chance. Each one could give us a single card to increase our knowledge or increase our intellect. So after all cards are played, we draw a single token from the chaos bag, and we're at 5. And we pulled a cultist. In this case, we would refer to the gathering card, and it says -1 if you fail, take 1 horror. Well, we were at 5, so now we're down to 4 because of our -1 from the token, but we're still equal or above the shroud value, so we get to take the clue. Okay, So this is basically how everything's done for fight and evade for the rest of for the other actions. So you also still have, they take different skill checks. So the fight action, if we're engaged with a monster such as swarm of rats, it would be here in our area to show that we're engaged with it. The creature's value for their fight, we compare fight values. Their fight value is on the top left hand side, and in this case it's 1 for the swarm of rats. The middle brown spot is their hit points. Okay, the rightmost spot with the feet is their agility if you're trying to evade with them. So basically it's our fight versus their fight is what we compare for the chaos. Now every time that you fight, unless otherwise stated by your cards, you only do 1 point of damage. The tricky thing about the creature cards is all their damage is down by right above their portraits. It's right above where it says enemy down here, and you'll see this particular one only does 1 point of damage. Some do more damage, some do damage and horror. And if it was horror, it would be located on the right side of the enemy tag right here. Okay, so evade is basically the same thing. What happens when you evade is right now the enemy is engaged with you, and if you were to win an evade check, the enemy goes exhausted at the location you're at right now. That means it cannot hit you in the enemy phase. And sometimes there's advantages to that. We'll go over them. Okay, so it's also important to note that if you are engaged with an enemy and you do any other action besides fight, evade, parlay, or resign, and parlay and resign we'll talk about in just 1 second, then you're going to take an attack of opportunity. So if you play a card, if you move, if you draw a card, if you gain a resource, if you investigate, you're going to take an attack of opportunity. And it's not just 1 damage, it's the full damage that the monster does. So in Swarm of Rats case, it would be 1 point of damage. It could be more, and it can be real devastating. So those are the actions. The next phase is the enemy phase. And some enemies have keyword hunter on them. The Swarm of Rats actually does. So if the enemy was exhausted, well, okay, that's not right. Let's just say I was at this location, but the enemy was here at this location. A hunter enemy, the first thing that happens during the enemy phase, all hunter enemies move closer to the investigator, to a investigator if there are no investigators present. The only exception to that is if an enemy is engaged with an investigator, an enemy is exhausted, and that's it. So, if an enemy is engaged or an enemy is exhausted, they don't move. Otherwise, if the enemy is readied, it will move to the investigator. It will move to an investigator. In this case, it would move over to me and then immediately engage. Okay. Next thing is if an engaged enemy attacks. Okay, so that basically there's no check. They just hit you. They do their full damage, whatever's on their card. The last thing we do is upkeep. So first thing we do is reset actions. We take our actions back. In normal case, it would be flipped over to the black and white side, and we just flip it. If I can grab it, there we go, and flip it back over. Now we're ready. Any exhausted cards, that includes in our play area, because some of our asset cards exhaust. Any exhausted cards reset or are readied. And in the case, if it's a readied monster, it immediately attaches to the investigator in the room, or it engages with the investigator in the room. Players gain a card and a resource. So we draw a card from our deck, and we gain a single resource. And the last thing we do is we check our hand size. We can only have a hand size of 8. So if we have over 8 cards, we discard down to 8, and we start the Mythos phase all over again. And we do that till either the act deck advances far enough for us to do for resolution, or we die, or the agenda deck advances far enough to cause a resolution. And that's it. Let's go play. Well, as usual, it wouldn't be a Sweet Strats show unless something screwed up. So I forgot to mention some rules while I was going. While I was rushing, I'm trying to get videos out. So the first thing I want to talk about is in multiple investigator games, you choose the lead investigator. Also, from round to round, you choose who can go first. Like I said, the reason why I forgot a bunch of these was because it's not going to apply to me, but I should have told you anyways. The next is, I forgot to tell you that you get 5 resources to start the game. That was quite important. 5 resources and 5 cards. Next is if another investigator is engaged with an enemy and you attack it and miss and fail your fight check, then the investigator that's engaged with the monster is going to take 1 point of damage. That's quite important in multiplayer games. Also, I didn't talk about the resign and parlay action. These are both actions that do not cause attacks of opportunity. And you're going to see them particularly on 2 cards. I'm guessing they're at the end of scenarios. I'm not sure. But the parlor has the resign. And basically what that does is you take that action. It doesn't cause an attack of opportunity. And you get to quit the game without dying. It's very helpful, as you'll see. Also, parlay is on Lita Chandler. And what she does is you make a check. And if you win the check, it's willpower check. If you succeed in your willpower check, then she comes and joins you. The last thing is that if there are multiple investigators at a location, and this is probably only going to apply to hunter enemies, but when an enemy moves into a location, not spawns, but moves into a location, if it has no designator to say who it attaches to, then the lead investigator is the person who chooses who that monster attaches to or engages. I keep saying attach, it's really engage. So it's who the lead investigator chooses who the monster engages with. And that's it. Well, I'm sure I probably forgot others, but I mean, other people do better. They do better rules video, and I'm sure I'm going to get better as the time goes on. And this is going to be choppy. So enjoy the games.